Okay. So first, Jay, can you like introduce yourself for the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm currently the first team sports scientist at Bristol Bears in the English Premiership Rugby Union. This is my fifth season with Bristol. Prior to that, I spent 2 years at Harlequins, also in the English Premiership. And before that, I did 2 years as an intern strength and conditioning coach at the University of Surrey. And I was doing that alongside my master's degree, and that was under the tutelage of James Wild, who really good coach and really good educator. I sometimes think if I could go back and not pay more attention, but soak a lot more in. I definitely left a lot of cards on the table when I was learning under James, and he definitely gave me the platform to develop into the coach and sports scientist I am today. But I definitely should have taken a lot more in when I was there. So studied at St Mary's University in London. I did my undergraduate in strength and conditioning science and picked up various little voluntary coaching roles and internships during 3 years there. And then I stayed on and I did my master's degree in sport rehabilitation. I was planning on going down the route of working within physiotherapy at that point, and I loved coaching, loved strength and conditioning, but I had a real desire to work within the rehab side of strength and conditioning and work with injured athletes and return to play. So that's why I did the master's there. And when I was at University of Surrey working as a strength and conditioning coach, I was tagging along some injury clinics, and I was working with the basketball team in the British Basketball League. And I started to become more aware of this load management idea that it was all over the realm of sports science at that time. And that's really when I started to become interested in the role of a sports scientist within sport. So that I ended up going more towards that route and away from this physiotherapy rehab route. And that's what set me up to where I am now, working with the basketball team, trying to implement some sports science practices and some strength and conditioning practices with them. And off the back of that, I was lucky to get the job at Harlequins as an assistant sports scientist, which was quite a junior role. It was a lot of data collection, data management, data reporting, and then passing on to the head of sports science, who would then make a lot more of the decisions alongside the head of performance. And again, that's another platform that got me to where I am now, where I still do a lot of the data handling roles, but I'm in a more senior position where I can help influence decisions and how we should be training and identifying certain players, certain weeks of how to manipulate our training, how to manipulate our load, for lack of a better term. And that's that really. I think it's quite a short career when I look at it, because I listen to podcasts and see interviews and people who've been doing 7, 8, 9, 10 years at one club, and I feel like I've been doing this a while, but realistically, I've only been doing it for 5 to 6 years.
Nice. So, um, for all those like experience you have, like you mentioned, like a few years ago, they're starting to have like tons of like coaching discuss about like um load management. Like I want to start with like GPS data. Do you guys use Catapult or Connexon?
We use Stat Sports. I've used
Oh,
Catapult previously, but we use Stat Sports here at Bristol.
cool. So, like, when you use that, what kind of metrics do you guys like track?
Yeah, so I love GPS. I think it's a really valuable tool. I think it can be not a it's never the answer to any of the questions. It might be the answer to some of the questions you have, but it's not the answer to load management and load monitoring. But it can certainly be a piece of the puzzle, and it can certainly help you inform you about your decisions that you want to make. So with Stat Sports or any of the manufacturers and providers, you're going to end up having the possibility to take 3, 4, 500 different metrics out of the system if you really wanted to. I narrow that right down. I still export quite a lot of them so I can have them in a database, because you never know at one time you're like, oh, actually, yeah, I do want to look retrospectively. I want to have a look at this metric, and it's just better to have it there than having to go back and do all the exports again. But I tend to narrow that down even further to what's important to us. So I always look at some kind of volume metrics. I don't like total distance. I think it doesn't really tell the picture that you want it to, because we're in an intermittent sport, right? Guys walk, they run, they sprint. They don't wear a GPS when they go down to the coffee shop with the girlfriend on Saturday morning. So I can't track that distance. You know, what happens if one of the players is missing a bus and he runs to it? I can't track that distance. So it's useful because it will indicate the overall volume of a session. So, you know, someone has a session of 6 kilometers, the chances of the other metrics being higher are greater. A session of 1,000 meters or 1 kilometer, the chances of higher speed and higher intensity metrics are going to be lower. Not always the case, but it will give you an indication of where it is. So I like to look closer into what's actually happening in metrics that matter, is what I try to deem it. And in rugby, it's quite difficult because we have very unique characters. I don't know if you've watched a lot of rugby, but the loose head prop is a hugely different character to one of our wingers. We're talking about someone that's 120 kilograms to someone that is 95 kilograms in a completely different profile. So what's important for me to look at the winger might be more time spent in, or distance covered in, the higher speed zones, whether that's a absolute speed of 5.5 meters per second, which is seemingly the default speed for a lot of guys when they talk about these high speed metrics, or relative to their max speed. I tend to look at both, one from a protection point of view, and one from a performance point of view. I think that rugby is played on everyone plays on the same pitch. So at some point you have to measure everyone on the same metric. If someone is a 10 meter a second runner and someone's a 9 meter a second runner, and they're both going for the ball, yes, one may reach it faster, but they still have to cover the same distance at X speed. So look at high speed volumes covered for all our players, but particularly those guys that are involved in high speed actions. And then for our forwards, which are the bigger guys, whilst we'll still look at that from a protection point of view and a performance point of view, what's more important to them in match play is probably the more sensitive acceleration, deceleration metrics. The way that we defend, we tend to come quite hard and quite fast off the line. So can we identify who is very good at accelerating from 0 meters a second to 4, 5, 6 meters a second, and how often can they do that in a game? If we have someone that has a really high capability of doing that, but they burn out quickly, what can I provide as an information to the coaches of that? Is it a case of, well, the density of this defensive block is probably the hardest part they're going to go through. So when X player does 6 accelerations in a minute, you may see the next minute they will tire out and they will drop off. But if we're going to keep defending for that period of time, is that a problem, or how can we manipulate that and tailor our training program to progress this and help the players access these abilities that they have? They're probably the two stock answers that you'll look at with any GPS provider, and probably any sports scientist. You'll look at distance covered in speed zones and the more mechanical actions. Those are the 2 or 3 things that I would present to coaches, and I would present them in 3 different ways. One being volume, like we spoke about, how big is the session or how much has a player done. One being intensity, how frequent have they done something, or relative to the time afforded, how much have they done? And that's when you start looking at distance per minute or accelerations per minute. And then I quite like to talk about things in density. And that's a bit harder to get over to coaches sometimes, because density is very much it's a physics term, mass per volume. And how do we then provide an idea of how that influences our training? And there's a great paper by Peter Tierney about high speed density. And that's basically talking about how you can have two complete different sessions which might have the same amount of high-speed volume. Let's say you run 200 meters of high-speed volume, I run 200 meters of high-speed volume, but you've done it in 2 big bursts up the field. I've done it across the course of 10 different high-speed efforts. So we've achieved the same thing in very, very different ways. And how is that different from person to person? And how can that be something to reflect the session? So we as a club have quite a lot of kick chase rugby at the minute. So our wingers are going to be doing loads and loads of these high-speed efforts, and there will be accruing distance in those efforts. Whereas another team that decides to play rugby, which is potentially just run everything, run from the back, run from the middle, run when you're in there, they might get fewer bouts of high-speed distances, but they might accrue more distance in those efforts, if that makes sense. So the density one's quite hard to get along, but those would be the 3 ways that I talk about them. And then you'll always have like an outlier. X player actually covered 800 high-speed meters. This doesn't reflect the session. This is actually an outlier because X, Y, Z, whatever reason you find. And aside from that, I probably wouldn't go in too much detail. I think you have to keep the complex quite simple, because otherwise you can lose the audience, and you never want to come down to a point of 2-3 years time and I'm handing a report to coaches and they're like, this has got 12 metrics on it, and you know what, over the last 4 years I've never looked at 8 of them, so why do we keep doing this? Whereas give them the 3, talk about that, and then maybe down the line and go like, is there anything we can use to quantify this? And say, well, actually, yeah, we could look at this metric, and I'll start to include that. Obviously, in my own interest, I go and have a look at various other things with the GPS metrics that are available to you, whether that's something to try and quantify fatigue. There's loads of great research around accelerometer drive metrics and how changes in running strategy or running strides might be an indicator of neuromuscular fatigue. I haven't done a trial study on that myself. I've just relied on the information that's been put out on others, and that might be something that further down the line I implement. There's a custom metric from Stat Sports called a DSL, dynamic stress load, which attempts to quantify the impacts and the movements of a player in X, Y, and Z axes. And if that increases throughout the course of a session, that might give you a good indicator that they are compromising somewhere else and they're requiring more effort to produce the same outcome. And that could be similar to how you might use VBT on a barbell. If someone's trying to move the same way, or a counter movement jump, if someone's jumping 40 centimeters all the time, but their contraction time on this one off is 800 milliseconds instead of 600 milliseconds, that sort of indicator of fatigue. One other metric, I'm talking for ages here. One other metric that we use with the Stat Sports GPS units is collisions, and they aren't necessarily a valid metric to quantify every single tackle and impact that happens in a rugby union game. But for us, they are reliable because we will use that metric day in, day out, week in, every single match. So we can now have a good understanding of what is a high collision match for a player. We have so much data, and 5 years worth of matches, 25 matches a year. We know that if player A has a normal match of 26 collisions, however that is measured, if he goes and has a match of 45 collisions, we know that that is a massive, massive collision-based match for him.
Nice. So, when it comes to like, let's say you said like there's like high speed running, there's like density side of metrics. How about like how many like deceleration they have, or like do you look at like also it's kind of the same with acceleration or linear speed? Is it like the deceleration must be the speed of enter the deceleration must be higher than certain velocity, and the speed of entering certain change of direction also need to be higher than certain speed? Am I
Yeah.
am I, yeah.
we look at the accelerations, we'll always have an understanding of what a player is doing there. We've set our acceleration thresholds at 3 meters per second. So a change in velocity from 0 to 3 or 1 to 4 that has to happen over the course of 1 second. Now, decelerations are a bit harder in rugby union because we have the nature of the contact sport. So if I run into you and I go from 4 meters a second down to 0 meters a second, I haven't truly decelerated. You've stopped me. So it's quite hard to dissociate the collisions from the decelerations. You could just create a custom sum of decelerations minus collisions is your true decelerations, but there's always going to be some kind of gray area there. The decelerations we would use more from a protection point of view of players, use them a lot in RTP for certain injuries. And how can we, same way that when you progress any athlete from the injury to returning back to the pitch, you will naturally want to progress every metric sensibly and then reintegrate them back into training or match play, hoping that they've actually exceeded all these things. So accelerations are certainly easier to do, and quantifying them, you can look at count of accelerations, so just the straight up number that you do in a given period of time, distance covered accelerating, and then you could have a look at accelerations per minute. I think that gives you a good idea of what's happening, but that will always be a very low number. In an 80-minute game of rugby, you might see 65 to 75 accelerations, give or take. So then that number is always going to be less than 1 when you're looking at the accelerations. Is that the right thing to look at? I'm not sure. There's some really cool work done by Jace Delaney. He looks at how you can really dive into a lot of these acceleration metrics and quantify how hard something truly is in and around these short spaces. I think he did it with either Australian rules football or American football. I'm not sure, but that was how he identified the very high taxing, high fatiguing elements of close quarters gameplay, which is definitely something that is applicable to us in rugby union. The hard part about rugby isn't really the running and the long distances. It's the sitting around the ruck and making sure that we can get off the line. Okay, we haven't made that tackle because someone else has. We need to now get back onto the onside line so we're not offside and so forth. So yeah, definitely look at accelerations and decelerations. What you want to do with it is pretty much up to you and to how deep you want to dive into it.
Cool. So when I talked to Pete, he also mentioned that when you guys track all those metrics, you kind of like combine it with heart rate, right? Am I correct? So, why you guys combine it with heart rate, and how did you actually do it?
So I'll start by saying the hardest thing we have with heart rate is player compliance. A lot of players don't like to wear it, and I understand that. That's fine. I'm not going to force them to wear it. The second thing we have is it's a contact sport, and these belts fall off all the time. So we've had, I think, 2 different types of heart rate belt. One of them's quite small and it was quite comfortable, but it would get ripped off in a tackle or in a collision. And I mean, these things are tiny, and I'm going to be searching the whole pitch for it. And at the end of the day, they get just chewed up by the lawnmower anyway. So then we go back to a bigger, longer one, which players don't like as much, and so interest in it drops down in the players a little bit. But we still have a number of guys that wear it, and what that gives us is a real nice indication of internal load. We track what you do with the GPS unit, and then we can track how you cope with it using the heart rate. And using it in an RTP progress is really easy because, like you say, it should be fairly linear. It should be gradually progress, gradually increase your tolerance to X, Y, and Z, and gradually find it easier when you're doing things. Using it in training, I like to use it as a more of a way to identify how difficult something is, or how difficult someone finds something to be. So if we have a really intense 3-minute period of the ball is always in play. It's constant rugby. We're going from attack to defense. How hard is player A finding this? And then after that 3 minutes, how quick will player A recover? Now, I don't use it for any real longitudinal tracking. I think it's too difficult to get good quality data for that. However, we do use it on day-to-day feedback to a player. And I won't send it to them necessarily, but if I catch them in the office or I catch them in the gym, I'll swing my laptop around and be like, hey, remember that when we did that really intense, 3 blocks of 3 minutes? Well, look at this trace here, right? That's your heart rate, and you recover really, really quickly. That's a good indication of your fitness. Remember last year where you were really struggling with it and you're trying to paint a picture with it. The reason that I think it's not a good tool for longitudinal load management for us is we will only wear it for that rugby session. So we will have it on for an hour and 20 minutes, but they could be exerting themselves in the gym in the morning significantly. Like, you go for a heavy 3 on back squat, your heart rate is going to be going up. I know mine certainly would. So we're missing that piece of the puzzle, and we're missing the part where, they could be in a meeting and they aren't paying attention, and then they get asked a question and their heart rate's going to go up, and your heart rate doesn't necessarily know the difference. Why is it causing it? We talk about heart rate as a high heart rate as a stressor, but there's a difference between having a high heart rate from maximal exertion in physical quality and having a high heart rate on a roller coaster. These two things don't mean the same thing. And I think high stress and high heart rate can be thought about in 2 different ways. So yes, we use it. We would use it to identify one-off instances or maybe a small period of tracking like RTP, but I wouldn't hang my hat on it, partly because I don't have enough confidence in my own application of it, but also because I think there's too many holes in the program.
Cool. So go back. I want to circle back to the previous topic we're discussing about like load management. So besides like GPS metrics, besides heart rate, what else did you guys do when it comes to like what sport technology or like do you guys also implement when it comes to like load management?
Yeah. So my first kind of adventure into load management was when I was working in basketball. So I was a fresh intern, just really, really keen with everything. And probably I knew less than I thought I knew. Basketball is it's poorly funded in the UK, a lot of money there. And I was trying to, doing the classic RPE with duration to try and identify a load. But the issue that I found with a lot of guys on a Tuesday night, I wouldn't see the Wednesday morning. And they're like, yeah, it was, I guess, a 6. And it wouldn't be that true to life as to what how difficult they actually found it. So I ended up just using purely duration for that. And we had one player who was, he won't mind me saying, he was slightly older, slightly aging. He's still playing now, actually. And he was having a lot of joint problems, just very stiff, very sore. I ended up sitting at training, watching him and counting the amount of times that he would do a layup or a dunk and landed, because to me, that was managing his load. If I can turn around to the coach and say, hey, today he's done 60 landings from the hoop. Tomorrow, can we make sure that he, in a skill session, doesn't leave the ground as much? And then you can periodize how you want this guy to be doing his high impact landings, vertical decelerations. And he's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense, because he's always quite tired and sore on a match day when we do back to backs. So the first technology I used was just my own eyes, and then obviously I move into a properly funded sport in rugby union where you have a little bit more opportunity to use kit. And at Quins, Harlequins, I think I just used GPS and heart rate. I don't think we really ever played about with anything else. At Bristol recently, we used a piece of kit which had an accelerometer strapped around the boot of a player, so we could quantify kick-in volume, which was really cool, actually. Obviously, in rugby, not every player kicks, but for certain players, it's a really high KPI, and it's one of their points of differences. So we were trying to understand what velocities would someone kick at is something that's quite cool, but more often the frequency of their kick in and how much of where do they put their kick in within a week. It's not necessarily a highly taxing movement, but for someone coming out of RTP, if kicking is their primary role on the pitch, we should treat that the same way that we treat anything else. So that's a cool bit of kit. That's from Player Maker, and that gave us a good insight into how players would spread the load between each feet. They didn't have this tool when we used it, but they are now trying to identify proper ground reaction forces as well, which would be very useful for load monitoring, especially for players that are coming back from stress injuries in the lower limb, particularly the foot. Aside from that, I think those would be the main two are GPS and heart rate. And I think your other load management tools probably come off the pitch. So stuff like force plates, stuff like gym awares, and kit that you can use to identify things within movements that might be affected by work that you've done on the pitch.
So when it comes to like monitoring athlete fatigue level, or their workload, do you guys, I know we discussed this before, you used to do chronic, what is it?
Acute chronic.
Yeah, acute chronic workload ratio. And now you don't use it. Can you explain like what is acute chronic workload ratio and why you don't use it now?
Yeah. So acute chronic, it's fairly new, but it's fundamentally comes from the back of Bannister's fitness fatigue model, right? So there's always going to be like an inverted U when it comes to training and performance, fitness, injury of any team or any athlete. So this can be relevant for anyone, right? So me, I'm not a runner. I would currently fit in the undertrained or inadequate training bandwidth of running. So my chronic load is 0 and my acute load is 0. If all of a sudden I went out tomorrow and ran 30 miles, I would completely swing the other way in terms of my acute training load, which would put me at an injury risk. Equally, if I went and did 3 miles every single day for 10 days, I'd probably be in the extremely overtrained bracket as well. So the idea around acute chronic, and this came around with the first Tim Gabbett suggested a lot of this stuff, and he identified the chronic workload and long-term training is a preventative mechanism for injury when looking at the changes in acute load. And it makes sense, right? The guys that train longer and more consistently should be less prone to breaking down with injury when they have a certain acute stimulus. The first, I think I'm getting this right now, but the first iteration of the acute chronic was looking at what happens in 7 days and what happens in the 28 previous days. Those were your two issues there. And that was just the classic like rolling average workload. And the thing that people didn't like around this, and certainly I don't like around this, is it completely discounts anything that happened 29 days ago. As soon as that day is done, it doesn't contribute to the model anymore. And that has its limitations because you don't have you need to have something that's probably reflecting the nature of the chronic load right more. So why all of a sudden does your chronic load just refer to 4 weeks? We have this week, for example, this season, we had a 5-week off season where players had downtime. And if I was just truly looking at their rugby training, they would come in on day one and they would all be chronically undertrained. These guys are professionals for 8 years. They have chronic training load. The acute is what happens on the day. So I think you cannot put those two things as an equal. And that's when the exponentially weighted moving average model came in. And that actually provided a little bit more of an emphasis on the recent workload and what was happening in those acute changes. Because injury occurrence is non-linear, right? It doesn't happen when X equals Y. And it doesn't happen when, because one person didn't train 2 days ago, it doesn't mean that they're all of a sudden at a higher risk. There's so many more factors into it. And I think the reason I don't use acute chronic is I don't have a good enough metric, as in an output metric or a load metric, to quantify any of, or quantify isn't the right word, to suggest that a player is at risk. Like we said, you can pull out 300 GPS metrics. I don't know which one's going to put someone at more risk than the other. The idea that one acceleration speed band zone is more of an injury risk to the other one is absurd. If I was working with distance runners who, albeit they don't run at the same speed the whole time, but they're always running, I think I would implement it. I think I would use that because that is something that is fairly constant and consistent. But in team sports, that becomes really, really difficult because there's so many facets and so many components to what they do on the pitch that you couldn't hang your hat on one thing. Now, I know a lot of guys would do it with SRPE, duration times RPE. And again, I think that's probably a little bit better than you trying to find and identify an external load metric. But like I say, guys, the way that we do our training, we do our units prior to our team training. So we do our scrums and our mauls and our lineouts at, let's say, 10 a.m. and they don't come off the pitch until 11:15. By the time that they're down there and they finish the session, they can't remember how hard those 3 minutes of scrums were. Like, that's a 10 out of 10 for the 3-minute period, right? But then they might have had a fairly lighter session. And that to me doesn't really warrant a reason to track it. I've seen someone use, I can't remember who it was now, they use RPE, but they say lungs and legs as an idea to see how out of breath they were in the session and how mechanically demanding it was. And I like that because, lungs and legs, your scrums in the legs and the sessions in the lungs. So that's the kind of the key reason that I don't use it is because I don't feel strongly enough that it would provide me enough information to direct our training one way or the other. If I went up to our director of rugby and I said, look, I'm sorry, this guy can't train today because his acute chronic in his high speed running is 1.5, no way. It's not going to go end well. It's not going to end well at all. So I think in team sport, particularly if you have a good coaching setup and a good coaching philosophy, things don't fluctuate too much. Things will be fairly consistent throughout the season. You'll have 2 training sessions and a match. You might have 3 training sessions if the schedule aligns, but everything's going to be fairly consistent. And if you, like I say, have that solid foundation of the coaching group who are experienced and well practiced and well prepared, you can be fairly certain that everyone is going to be in a consistent training load. And we spoke offline that I now just use experience, like my own experience, my own relationships with the players, and sometimes just cross my fingers and hope for the best, because we can't attach. This is the other thing. It's a mathematical equation. maths has no business interfering with hamstrings. You know, just because one ratio determines that someone might be more at risk, there's nothing to tell me that the 7 divided by 28 workload ratio knows anything about the pronation angle of this guy's hamstring and why he might be at more risk of an injury. That was a bit of a rant.
That is so true. That is so true. I mean, like nowadays there's like more and more sport technology, and there's like more and more data, more and more metrics, more and more numbers, and people constantly only look at those numbers instead of like watching how athlete move, watching how, or just asking how they feel. Man, they're missing a lot.
Yeah, and you can, if you really want to find something, you can find it, but it's going to take you a while. And by the time that you found it, you're probably 3-4 days after the incident.
Yeah, that is so true. That is so true. So, um, overall, like, for in your experience, in your role, I thought it was like, because when Pete introduced you to me, he said you are the sports scientist, and I thought it was more of a data driven guy. I'm sorry it started that, but now as like we have more conversation, I feel like at the end of the day, we're dealing with when we deal with our athlete, they're still human. There's still like a lot of stuff that we need to like just watch, observe instead of like you said, maybe just look in those data. Am I
Yeah,
correct?
yeah, no, certainly. It definitely is. It's a data driven. It can be a data driven job, but I think it needs to be a data informed job or role. So I have so much data every single day. I'm learning to be better with data because I didn't come through a particularly numbers heavy route. Like I say, I did strength and conditioning for a long time, and I coached for a long time. I had to learn a lot of the statistics side of sports science and the data manipulation side of it. And we have a data scientist in our office who is far better than I am. So if I get stuck with anything, I tend to ask him. But the benefit of having a coaching background within sports science is you have these people skills and you have the ability to build and understand relationships with players. So whenever we have a match or a training session, I'll do all the GPS download analysis, and then I'll send the reports on to our head of performance. And I could leave it at that. And, you look at this number, here's the percentage, here's a red flag, here's an amber flag. But I always make sure that I fill it in with some key points. And that key point might be player A has had an unusually high volume of high speed running. This might be something that we need to look out for because in recent weeks, he hasn't had this amount of high speed. This could be something that we change in the session plan going forward, or we're in the clear because this player is not playing tomorrow. This is a non-selected player. Can we make sure that his match day has less high speed and so forth from that? So having an understanding of programming and periodization within the training cycle means that you can take these data-driven responsibilities and attach a human element into it. And I think there's loads of sports scientists that do this, and some that are far better than I am, will have a great understanding of what I said it to someone the other day. It's like the numbers can give you the information, but you have to tell the story about it, and that's where I think a lot of people could get hung up on it, and you miss this story part because numbers are just a sheet on a paper at the end of the day, and we need to provide the context to it.
So is it easy or is it like hard to like communicate, use all those that communicate with like your strength coach, like put your performance coach like Pete, and other like maybe like the director of the rugby team?
Yeah, I think it's the important thing when you're talking with anyone really is if you have a good, solid, sound relationship with them, then it's easy to do anything. We have a good department in Bears here where everyone actually we share information all the time and we'll present to one another on various things so everyone's on the right page. It will never be a case of me talking to one person and they're like, what do you mean HMLD? What is that? Everyone knows what it is because we share that information. And it's when you go higher up the chain, so to the director of rugby, for example, or any of the technical coaches, that's when it can be difficult, but that's because I would make it difficult in explaining something to them. You know, you just, as I said at the start, pick your bullets and take your three key things, and you have to make sure that those three key things, or preferably less, two key things, tell them what you want to tell them. As soon as you start going down a rabbit hole of X, Y, and Z and all of these numbers, you've probably lost them. So it is as easy or as difficult as you want to make it. And that goes for players as well. Like we have some players that will want to have 7, 8, 9 key points. We'll have some players that aren't interested in the slightest. So it's all about understanding who you're talking to.
I like it. I like it. Even yeah, just like you mentioned, even if it's a data-driven job, still there's still a lot of like human relationship part in it. And like you mentioned, all those data you need to narrow down and find a way to communicate with um other professionals like strength coaches, like rugby coaches. Man, I mean, it's fascinating.
Yeah, and that's why artificial intelligence will never take our jobs.
Yeah, yeah, I like it. I like the conclusion, man. So, for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, probably either LinkedIn or Twitter. I mean, my handle is just my name, Jake Gillis. I put a few bits out every now and again, and but yeah, just I'm happy to chat whenever and whoever.
Nice, nice.